Hey guys, it's Alexis, aka The Soft Reader, and I'm here today to do kind of not really a recommendations video, but more of a discussion about my favorite books that I was required to read in school. Haley did this video a couple of weeks ago, and I'll actually link to her video down below, where she kind of talked about her favorite required reading books, and it got me intrigued to mention some of mine. And so I have 10 here, and these I think span from when I was a freshman, a 9th grader in high school, and I think there's one of these from when I was in college, because I only ever took one English class in college, so yes. But most of these I think are pretty famous works. I don't think any of these are going to be like unheard of. Maybe one. Maybe. I don't know, but these are my favorite books that I was ever required to read in school, so most of these are also, if I were to film a favorite classics video, most of these would show up on there as well. But they're not quite the same video because I have read classics outside of school that I've really enjoyed, so yes, if I do make that video, it won't be for a while because a lot of these books are going to be the same. The first one I'm going to mention is the one I read the summer in between my 10th and 11th grade year in high school, and that was The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is one of my top 10 favorite books. I love this book so much. Hilariously, it's both my brother and I, it's also one of our favorite books. So I think we encourage each other to continue loving it because we love to have discussions about it all the time. This is a story about pretty unlikable people. Most of the characters in the story you kind of dislike, but you guys know I'm a fan of books about intentionally unlikable characters, so I think that is definitely one of the things that drew me to this story. I'm also a huge fan of books that are autobiographical for the author's work. There's quite a few on this list that fall into that category, and that's definitely true for this story and F. Scott Fitzgerald. A lot of it mirrors his own life, and so as a scholar that really interests me, and I think that's part of the reason I fell so in love with this book, was because it encouraged me to learn more about F. Scott Fitzgerald himself. The next one I'm going to mention is actually a play, and it is my favorite Shakespeare tragedy, and that is actually Hamlet. I read Hamlet when I was a senior in high school, so my last year in high school. And I know it's cliche to say that Hamlet is your favorite Shakespeare tragedy, but it really is. I think there's so much about Hamlet that is just so good, and I love so many of the soliloquies in the story and so much of the dialogue I absolutely love. I love the characters. Again, they're kind of a batch of unlikable people. I think Hamlet is a very interesting main character. And so all of those things really affect my enjoyment of Hamlet. It definitely is a Shakespearean tragedy, and you know those all kind of follow a same formula in a sense, but I really do love Hamlet so much, and again, part of my love for it is just that there's so many great soliloquies that Hamlet delivers that I absolutely adore. The next one I'm going to mention is one I mention a lot on my channel, I think, and that is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Again, I read this the summer of my 12th year, so my final year in high school. Again, this is one of my all-time favorite books, one of my favorite classics. I don't feel like I really have to explain Pride and Prejudice. I'm pretty sure most people know what Pride and Prejudice is about. Pride and Prejudice to me is just funny. A lot of the wit in this book makes me crack up laughing. I love the characters. I really like Elizabeth. I love Jane. I love the entire Bennet family. I love Darcy. I love Bingley. So I just absolutely love these characters. I love so much of what Jane Austen has to say in this book about marriage and society and, you know, socioeconomic status essentially, and just, yeah, I read this that summer and absolutely fell in love with it, and it's still a favorite to this day. The next one I'm going to mention is one I read in my 11th year of high school, or my 11th year, which is when I was a junior in high school, and that is House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. I love this book so much. This basically tells the story of 3 women within the same family, and it's magical realism, so a lot of it has to do with how these generations affect each other and how they reflect upon one another, and kind of how the mistakes in one generation kind of flow through to the following generations. And it takes place during the Chilean Revolution, the Chilean Civil War. I'm not quite sure what's the correct term for it. I love multi-generational family stories, which is very much what this is. I love Isabel Allende's magical realism. I think she does a phenomenal job at it. This book is in part a little autobiographical for Isabel Allende. Again, see, I really love that. And so, yes, I love this book so much, and if you guys are ever looking for either a magical realism story or a story about multiple generations in a family, I highly, highly recommend House of the Spirits because it honestly will completely blow you away. The next one I'm going to mention is the book that completely compelled me to fall in love with this particular author, and that is A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. I am a very, very large fan of Hemingway's works, and I'm also kind of a scholar of Hemingway's life. I love to learn about Ernest Hemingway. And A Farewell to Arms is very much autobiographical for Hemingway's early years. This tells the story of Lieutenant Henry, who is an ambulance driver on the Italian front in World War I, and so it's basically kind of about his story and how things happened to him, and subsequently other things happened to him. It's very, very closely the story of Ernest Hemingway's time as an ambulance driver on the Italian front in World War I. And so I love that. I love so much that I can read this book and very much identify the parallels with Hemingway's own life. I'm a huge fan of Ernest Hemingway's style. He writes very vaguely. He does not have a very flowery writing. He always used to say that he didn't like to hit his readers over the head with the symbolism, and he didn't want the metaphors and the symbols and stuff in his books to be very, very blatant. So they're kind of just laid out there. People like to say about Old Man in the Sea, whether or not the fish is really a fish, and that's very much Ernest Hemingway's style, and I really like that. I think it makes critiquing his books and reading them on a literary critic level very interesting because he doesn't really give you much to work with. But yes, I absolutely love this book. This is not necessarily my favorite Ernest Hemingway book, but every other book by him I've read, I didn't read for school, but this is the first one by him I ever read, and I absolutely fell in love with it, and I fell in love with him as well. The next book I'm going to mention is one of my all-time favorite books anyway. I think it's a lot of people's all-time favorite books. I studied this one the summer before my 10th year, and it was just the perfect time in my life to read it. I had just suffered a personal loss, and this book just, gosh, means so much to me for the timing I read it in as well, and that is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. I love this book so immensely. What makes this book super unique is that it's told from the perspective of Death. And so it's Death watching Liesl's story, and he comments on it, and so much of the commentary is really beautiful, and just the little asides that Death has are just really, really beautiful, and I love this book. It is by far probably my favorite required reading book I've ever had, just because it's one of my top 5 favorite books of all time anyway, so love this book. The next one I'm going to mention is one I read my first year in high school, and I actually debated not putting it on this list because at the time that I read it, I actually didn't like it at all. It wasn't until a few years later when I had studied it a little bit more intimately. Now it's one of my all-time favorite stories. So I figured, oh, what the hell, I'd put it on this list anyway, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Again, I didn't really love the story the first time I read it, and there's a lot of little themes throughout Frankenstein that make it really, really a phenomenal story. Again, yeah, I didn't love it the first time, but it's absolutely one of my favorite stories now. I think it's a good introduction to spooky stuff because it's really not scary in my opinion, but it's considered like a classic horror work, so yes. Frankenstein. The next one I'm going to mention is the shortest on this list. It's another play, and it's one I feel like most people probably have not heard of, but it's actually my favorite play I've ever read. It's like 60 pages, but it's absolutely beautiful. I read it in one sitting and I cried through like the entire last half of it. I love this story so much, and that is Master Harold and the Boys by Ethel Fugard, I believe it is. Ethel Fugard? I don't remember. I just say Fugard. And so basically, Fugard is a South African author, and the story takes place in South Africa during apartheid. And it basically all takes place in one setting in the span of like a couple of hours. So I love that. I love that use of setting. So it's about our main character, Harold, who is, I want to say either 12 or 14, I don't quite remember. And he is white, and it is about the two black South African kind of like servants who work for his mother. And it's a lot about the relationship he has with these two men, and about their different statuses in life under apartheid. And it's a lot about the relationship that Harold has with his father and with this one of these servants, Sam. But it's so beautiful. It's my favorite play I've ever read. I love it so much. So much. It's for such a short play. It's so impactful. And of course I'm not South African, but I do really, really love the perspective on apartheid. And so yes, so if you like plays and you've never read Master Harold before, or if you're interested in a play that takes place during apartheid, I'd highly, highly recommend this play because I love it so much. The next one I'm going to mention is another one I read the summer before I started high school, and that is Edith Hamilton's Mythology. This is basically a collection of Greek, Roman, and Norse myth. It's like sectioned off Greek, Roman, and Norse, and it kind of starts with their creation stories and goes through, and it covers the gods and heroes and monsters and kind of how the three all interact, and maybe if there is like a world-ending myth, such as in Norse mythology, she covers that as well. Edith Hamilton is considered pretty much an expert on this. This is a very, very, I think, especially here in the States, this is a very, very much read book. I've always loved mythology growing up. I had coloring books basically, or picture books about Greek mythology, so that really sparked my interest in mythology, but I actually genuinely have an interest in mythology of all cultures, really. But this was my first foray into Norse mythology by this Edith Hamilton collection, and I absolutely loved this. If you're just looking to familiarize yourself a little bit more with myths, or if you just enjoy myths and you like reading them written out, I highly recommend Edith Hamilton's Mythology because it's a lot of fun. Alright guys, so you should let me know down below what your favorite required reading is, or what your couple of your favorite required readings were. I'd love to hear those, and I'll see you guys soon with another video. Bye!